Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 2011. The city lay still under the weight of the late hour, its streets shrouded in silence, interrupted only by the occasional distant hum of passing cars. The quiet suburban neighborhood where Sarah Johnson lived had long settled into the peaceful lull of the night, with streetlights casting elongated shadows across empty sidewalks. Behind the modest walls of her single-story home, the world should have been safe, secure, untouched by the violence that so often tainted the darker corners of the city. But that illusion shattered the moment she opened her eyes. Something had pulled her from sleep, something out of place. At first, she lay still, unsure whether it was a lingering dream or a real disturbance. The sound had been faint, perhaps the groan of wood settling or the whisper of fabric brushing against the surface. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate creak, as if weight shifted upon an aging floorboard. A chill spread through her body, tightening her chest. She had always been a light sleeper, conditioned by years of single parenthood and the quiet fears that came with raising a daughter alone. Reaching instinctively for her phone on the nightstand, she hesitated when the sound returned, this time unmistakably closer, carrying with it a tension that thickened the air. Her pulse quickened. Lauren. Her daughter's room was just across the hall. 16 years old, bright, full of dreams, a girl whose laughter once filled this home with warmth. The thought of her in danger made Sarah's blood turn cold. Slowly, cautiously, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as the mattress shifted beneath her weight. The floor beneath her bare feet was cool, grounding, but it did little to steady the growing panic gnawing at her ribs. Moving carefully, she crept toward the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The house was still, too still. Yet, beneath that silence, she could hear it, the sound of movement, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the rustling of a stray breeze, nor the harmless settling of an old house. Someone was inside. Her grip tightened around the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. Instead, she inched it open just enough to peer through the crack. The dim hallway stretched ahead, shadows pooling in the corners. Then she saw them. Two figures, dark silhouettes against the faint slivers of moonlight filtering through the blinds. One was tall, lean, his movements quick and fluid. The other was broader, his heavy steps pressing into the wooden floor with a quiet but distinct weight. They moved without hesitation, with the confidence of men who had done this before. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her first instinct was to retreat, to hide, to make herself as small as possible in hopes that they wouldn't notice her. But before she could act, they turned toward Lauren's room. She wanted to scream. Wanted to rush forward, to do something, anything, to stop them. But fear rooted her to the spot, suffocating her like a hand pressed firmly over her mouth. The door to Lauren's room creaked open. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then came the gasp, the sharp intake of breath as her daughter woke to the unfamiliar presence looming over her. A second later, chaos erupted. The rustle of sheets being yanked away. The muffled cry of confusion that turned into terror. A sharp thud as a body hit the mattress, struggling, thrashing. Sarah took a step back into the shadows, her entire body trembling. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she bit them back, pressing herself against the wall. If she moved, if she made even the slightest noise, they would know she was there. And then what? She could hear Lauren pleading now, her voice high and raw, filled with desperation. The sound of fabric tearing sent a violent shudder through Sarah's body. One of them laughed, a low, guttural chuckle that made her stomach twist. There was a sickening rhythm to it all, the way they spoke to each other in hushed voices, the way Lauren's cries punctuated the silence. Then came the sound of flesh meeting flesh, a slap, a hit, something that sent her daughter's body thudding against the headboard. Sarah's nails dug into her palms. She felt like she was drowning, trapped beneath the crushing weight of her own helplessness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Silence settled over the house once more, thick and suffocating. Footsteps moved toward the door, unhurried, careless. One of the men muttered something, and the other laughed. Then there was the clatter of something metallic hitting the floor. A knife. The sound echoed through the empty hall like the final note of a song played to its grim conclusion. A moment later, the front door opened. Then shut. They were gone. Sarah didn't move for a long time. The air felt too thick, her lungs too weak to draw breath. Slowly, shakily, she forced her legs to move, her knees almost giving out beneath her as she stepped forward. Lauren's door was ajar. The dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating the destruction left in their wake. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted and discarded. A shattered lamp lay on the floor, the shards catching the faint light like jagged stars. The smell of sweat and something metallic hung heavy in the air. And then there was Lauren. She was curled up at the foot of the bed, her body trembling, her breath ragged. Blood stained her nightshirt. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared at nothing. Sarah collapsed to her knees beside her, her hands hovering uselessly over her daughter's battered form. A strangled sob tore from her throat, but no sound came. The world had ended. Everything was gone. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness, painting the walls of the house in bursts of red and blue. The wailing sirens, once deafening, faded into a distant hum as uniformed officers moved methodically through the scene. Neighbors peeked through half-closed blinds, but made no move to step outside. This was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where silence was an unspoken agreement. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her body rigid, hands curled into fists on her lap. She barely registered the movements around her. The house, once warm and familiar, had become an alien landscape, filled with figures in dark uniforms murmuring among themselves, taking notes, asking questions she barely heard. They moved with cold efficiency, stepping over broken glass, kneeling beside the bed where her daughter had last breathed, snapping photographs of what remained. The detective spoke in hushed tones, their words slipping through the air like dry leaves skittering across pavement. They mentioned things like forced entry, struggle, and trauma, but none of it mattered. Nothing they said could change the weight pressing against her ribs, the crushing emptiness spreading through her chest like ink in water. One of them, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt hollow, meaningless. He assured her they were doing everything they could. He told her they would find the men responsible. She didn't believe him. They collected evidence, dusted for prints, asked if she had seen anything, heard anything. She answered in monosyllables, her voice flat, distant, as though it belonged to someone else. She told them she had been asleep when the men entered. She told them she had hidden, paralyzed by fear. She didn't tell them how she had heard every sound, how she had seen it all unfold, how the memory was carved into her mind like an unhealed wound. Eventually, they left, taking their notepads, their cameras, their empty reassurances with them. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. The absence of Lauren's presence pressed against Sarah's skull, a relentless drumbeat of grief that would not stop. The funeral came too quickly. It was small, almost perfunctory. A handful of distant relatives, a few of Lauren's teachers from school, an old friend of Sarah's who hadn't spoken to her in years but now stood beside her, murmuring condolences that rang hollow. The coffin was closed. It had to be. Sarah stood by the graveside, the cold autumn wind cutting through her coat, biting at her skin. She barely felt it. The priest spoke, but his words were just sounds, meaningless syllables strung together to fill the void. She stared at the polished wood of the casket, at the deep gash in the earth where it would be lowered, and felt nothing but the weight of finality pressing down on her bones. Afterward, people told her to take time to grieve, to rest, to heal. They sent flowers she did not acknowledge, left voicemails she did not listen to. She moved through the days in a fog, barely aware of time passing. She slept in short, restless bursts and woke up gasping, reaching for something that was no longer there. The police called a few days later. They had names. 2 men. Jason Brooks, 29, a repeat offender with a long history of arrests for assault, breaking and entering, and domestic violence. He had been in and out of prison since he was 17 but had never served more than a few months at a time. The second, Terrence Martin, 32, was a known drug dealer with suspected ties to organized crime. His record was filled with charges that never seemed to stick. They had been questioned. They denied everything. There wasn't enough evidence for an arrest. Sarah listened to the detective's voice on the other end of the line, the careful tone, the measured words. They were trying. They just needed more time. She hung up without replying. Days blurred together. The house remained untouched, frozen in time. Lauren's schoolbooks were still stacked on the dining table, the sweater she had left draped over the back of a chair remained untouched, her scent still clinging to the fabric. Sarah avoided her bedroom, knowing she could not bear the silence that waited inside. The phone rang again. The case was still open. The detectives were following leads. They would keep her updated. More meaningless words. Weeks passed. Then months. Nothing changed. Jason Brooks and Terrence Martin were still free, still walking the same streets, living their lives as if nothing had happened. The police continued their investigation, but the tone in their voices grew more restrained, their updates more infrequent. Sarah stopped answering their calls. She stopped eating regularly. Sleep came in fractured moments, but when it did, it brought nightmares. She saw Lauren's face, saw her reaching out, heard the echoes of her screams ricocheting through the house. She woke up drenched in sweat, her throat raw, her pulse hammering against her ribs. One evening, she found herself standing in Lauren's room, surrounded by remnants of a life that had been stolen too soon. The wall still bore the posters of musicians her daughter had loved, the bookshelf still held the dog-eared novels she had read and reread. A half-full water bottle sat on the nightstand, untouched since the night she had died. Sarah sank onto the bed, her fingers tracing the indents on the pillow where Lauren's head had once rested. The grief was not sharp anymore, it was dull, heavy, a stone lodged permanently in her chest. The world had moved on. No one was coming to save her. No one was going to bring justice. The next morning, she left the house for the first time in weeks. The sky was overcast, a dull gray stretching endlessly above her. The cemetery was nearly empty when she arrived. The grass around Lauren's grave was damp from the recent rain, the earth still freshly packed. She stood there for a long time, staring down at the simple marker bearing her daughter's name. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves, whispering through the stillness. Something inside her hardened. She had waited long enough. She would not wait any longer. Sarah moved with purpose. She had no formal training, no background in law enforcement, no experience in surveillance. But she had something else, something stronger than skill or knowledge. She had rage. Cold, steady, unrelenting rage that simmered beneath the surface, sharpening her focus and hardening her resolve. The first thing she did was gather information. The police had given her names, Jason Brooks and Terrence Martin. That was all she needed. Jason Brooks had spent most of his life in and out of prison, never serving more than a few months before slipping back into the world like a cockroach scuttling through the cracks. He had been arrested for assault, for theft, for breaking into homes just like hers, but nothing ever stuck. There were always technicalities, always a lack of evidence, always a system that let him walk free. He lived in a rundown apartment complex in the southern part of the city, a place where crime was routine, where people knew better than to ask questions. Terrence Martin was different. He was smarter, more careful. He had built himself a reputation in his neighborhood as someone you didn't cross. A drug dealer with connections, the kind of man who made problems disappear. He had never served time, though everyone knew he was guilty of more than the police could prove. His home was a rental, a small house with reinforced locks and security cameras, a place he treated like a fortress. He was paranoid, cautious, always looking over his shoulder. But not enough. Sarah started small. She learned their routines. She parked her car across from Brooks' apartment, watching as he came and went. He had a habit of sleeping late, emerging around noon with bloodshot eyes, rubbing at his face like a man who had spent the night drinking or worse. He met with people in alleyways, exchanged cash for small bags, leaned into car windows to have quick, whispered conversations. Some nights he spent at bars, some nights at strip clubs, but he always came home alone. He never looked nervous. He never seemed afraid. Martin was harder to track. He moved unpredictably, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. When he did return, it was usually in the early hours of the morning, pulling into his driveway in an expensive black car with tinted windows. He rarely walked alone, always had someone nearby, an enforcer, a lookout, a shield. But even shields had weak spots. Sarah didn't just watch. She prepared. She changed her appearance. Her natural curls were gone, straightened and dyed a darker shade. She switched her clothing, trading in her usual comfortable attire for oversized hoodies, thick scarves, anything that would make her harder to recognize. She started wearing gloves, even when it wasn't cold, training herself to keep her fingerprints off everything she touched. She began moving differently, walking with purpose but without drawing attention, learning the streets in ways she never had before. She memorized escape routes, shortcuts, alleyways where cameras didn't reach. She started carrying a knife, not for self-defense, but for something else entirely. The first time she approached Brooks was in a liquor store. She didn't speak to him, didn't even look at him directly, but she was close enough to hear his voice, to see how he moved. He was loud, cocky, leaning against the counter as he flirted with the cashier, flashing a grin that made Sarah's stomach turn. He had no idea who she was. She followed him out, trailing a safe distance behind, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something darker, something more dangerous. She could take him right there, in the parking lot. One quick move, a blade in the right place, and it would be over. But not yet. She needed more time. 2 weeks passed, and she became a shadow. She moved through their world unseen, blending into the background, learning every detail she could. She knew what time Brooks left his apartment, how long he stayed out, when he was most vulnerable. She knew which bars Martin frequented, which alley he used to meet his clients, which doors he left unlocked. And she knew that no one would mourn them. They had done this before, countless times, to countless people. Lauren had not been their first victim. She would not have been their last. They thought they were untouchable. Sarah was going to prove them wrong. Jason Brooks spent his nights in the same place, a dive bar on the outskirts of the city, where the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke clung to the walls like a second layer of paint. It was a place where no one asked questions, where men like him could drink without fear of judgment, surrounded by others who carried the same stains on their souls. Sarah had watched him for over a week, learning his habits, studying the rhythm of his nights. He arrived late, usually after 10, slipping into his usual seat at the bar, where the bartender already knew what to pour. His friends came and went, men like him, loud and reckless, exchanging slurred jokes and meaningless stories, their voices rising above the dull hum of music from the jukebox. They slapped each other on the back, laughing at things that weren't funny, their careless ease a stark contrast to the darkness that clung to them. Sarah sat in a corner booth, wrapped in anonymity. No one looked at her. No one noticed the way her eyes tracked Jason's every move, the way she barely touched the drink in front of her. She blended in, just another shadow in the dimly lit space. She knew how to make herself small, invisible. She waited. Jason drank too much, as he always did. He leaned against the bar, his posture growing looser, his speech slower, his laughter turning into a lazy, open-mouthed grin. His friends trickled out one by one, leaving him alone with his last drink, muttering something to the bartender before tossing a few bills onto the counter. He swayed as he stood, rubbing a hand across his face before making his way to the exit. Sarah moved a second after he did. Outside, the night air was thick with humidity, carrying the distant sounds of the city, the low rumble of traffic, the occasional blare of a car horn, a siren wailing somewhere too far away to matter. The streetlights cast long, broken shadows, stretching across the pavement in jagged shapes. Jason stumbled as he walked, his steps uneven, his boots scuffing against the sidewalk. His apartment was less than 10 minutes away on foot, but he took his time, muttering to himself, occasionally stopping to light a cigarette with shaking hands. He was alone. Sarah followed at a distance, her pace steady, her breath controlled. Her heartbeat remained even. This was what she had planned for. He cut through an alley, a shortcut he used often, oblivious to how the darkness swallowed him whole. The buildings on either side loomed high, their facades lined with rusting fire escapes and graffiti that had faded into something unrecognizable. A single street lamp flickered at the far end, barely piercing the gloom. This was where she had decided it would happen. She quickened her pace, closing the distance between them in silence. He never heard her coming. The brass knuckles in her right hand fit snugly, the metal cold against her fingers. She struck him hard, aiming for the side of his head, and the sound was muffled by the thick night air. Jason staggered, his cigarette falling from his lips as he let out a startled grunt, his body pitching sideways. Before he could catch himself, she struck again. The second blow sent him to the ground, his back hitting the damp pavement with a dull thud. He groaned, one hand fumbling toward his face, his movements sluggish, uncoordinated from alcohol and sudden pain. Blood seeped from his temple, dark and thick, catching the faint glow of the street lamp. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the front of his jacket and dragged him deeper into the alley, where the shadows swallowed them completely. He struggled, but his strength was fleeting, his limbs unresponsive. He tried to speak, his lips forming something that never became words. She didn't give him the chance. Her knife was already in her other hand, the handle firm against her palm. The same kind of knife he had once used, the same kind of blade that had stolen the last breath from her daughter's lips. Jason's eyes widened as the realization hit. He tried to move, his muscles tensing for a fight that was already lost. The knife sliced across his throat in one swift, clean motion. His body convulsed, his hands flying to the wound as if he could hold the life inside him, as if he could stop the inevitable. Blood spilled between his fingers, gurgled in his throat, coated the front of his jacket in a spreading stain. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. Sarah watched. She watched as the panic turned to confusion, as his limbs jerked weakly, as his eyes lost focus. She had imagined this moment 100 times, had pictured what it would feel like to stand over him, to take from him what he had taken from her. It didn't feel like justice. It didn't feel like relief. It just felt necessary. His body finally stilled, the last of his breath escaping in a ragged exhale. The alley fell silent again, the city carrying on as if nothing had happened. Sarah didn't linger. She wiped the knife against his jacket, pocketed it, and stepped back. Her gloves were clean, her face masked by the shadows. She turned and walked away, her footsteps light against the pavement. By the time the sun rose, Jason Brooks' body had been found in a dumpster behind the alley, his blood staining the concrete like a forgotten warning. Terrence Martin was not an easy target. Unlike Jason Brooks, who moved carelessly through life, convinced of his own invincibility, Terrence was cautious. He was a man who had learned to watch his back, who understood that the streets had their own rules, and that survival belonged to those who never let their guard down. He rarely went anywhere alone, always surrounded by a rotating cast of men who operated more as bodyguards than friends. He spoke in low tones, made transactions in quick, practiced movements, and never lingered in one place longer than necessary. Sarah studied him. She followed at a distance, taking note of every pattern, every habit. She learned that he carried a gun, tucked into the waistband of his jeans beneath his oversized hoodie. He rarely drew it, but the weight of it was enough to remind those around him that he was dangerous. He knew how to move through a crowd unnoticed, slipping between people like a shadow. But despite all his precautions, he had one weakness. The river. It was his escape, his sanctuary. The one place where he let his guard down. He went there late at night, always alone, rowing out onto the dark water in a small boat he kept tied to the docks. It was the only time he ever seemed at peace, the only time he allowed himself to be vulnerable. Sarah waited for the right night. The air was heavy with moisture, thick with the scent of wet wood and stagnant water. The river stretched into the darkness, its surface smooth and undisturbed. A few boats bobbed gently in their slips, their hulls creaking against the docks. Streetlights flickered along the far end of the waterfront, but here, where the river curled away from the main road, there were no cameras, no prying eyes. Terrence was already there, crouched near his boat, untying the rope that secured it. His back was to her. Sarah moved soundlessly, her fingers tightening around the length of metal pipe she had taken from a construction site 2 days earlier. The weight of it was reassuring, solid in her grasp. She was 5 steps away when he straightened. For when he reached into his pocket for his phone, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. 3 when he muttered something under his breath, his other hand moving toward his waistband, where the gun sat hidden beneath his hoodie. 2 when she swung the pipe. The sound was dull, a sickening thud as metal met flesh and bone. Terrence let out a choked gasp, his body jerking forward as his legs buckled beneath him. His phone slipped from his fingers, landing on the wooden dock with a hollow clatter. He swayed for a moment, caught in the haze between consciousness and oblivion. Then he crumpled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dropped the pipe and grabbed him by the shoulders, dragging him toward the edge of the dock. He was heavy, his body limp, dead weight in her grip. She could feel the rise and fall of his shallow breathing, the weak twitch of his muscles as his brain tried to process what had happened. She shoved him into the water. He hit the surface with a splash, his body sinking before instinct kicked in and he began to struggle. His arms flailed, his head breaking through the water for a single, desperate gulp of air before Sarah was on him, her hands pressing down on his shoulders, forcing him under. He thrashed. Water churned around them, dark and violent, his movements wild and uncoordinated. His hands clawed at her arms, his fingers digging into her skin, but she held firm. The river absorbed his screams, swallowing the sounds before they could escape into the night. His struggle grew weaker. His limbs jerked sporadically, his fingers loosening their grip. Air bubbles rose to the surface, then fewer, then none at all. She held him down for another full minute. Then 2. When she finally let go, his body floated motionless beneath the water, the currents beginning to pull him away. His face, pale beneath the surface, stared up at nothing. Sarah stepped back onto the dock, her breaths coming fast and sharp. Water dripped from her hands, soaking into the sleeves of her jacket. She watched as the river carried him away, his form growing smaller, disappearing into the night. The next morning, his body washed up on the far side of the river, tangled in the reeds along the shore. The police were called. Investigators arrived, speaking in clipped tones, snapping photographs, making notes. His death was ruled as suspicious but inconclusive. A drowning. An accident. No one connected it to Jason Brooks. No one connected it to Sarah. She had made sure of that. The house was silent. Not the fragile, suffocating silence that had settled over it in the days after Lauren's death, when grief had crept into every corner like an unwanted guest. Not the kind of silence that came from absence, from the hollow space left behind by a voice that would never be heard again. This silence was different. It was steady, solid. It filled the house not with emptiness, but with something else, something final. Sarah sat in the living room, cradling a framed photograph in her hands. Lauren's smile stared back at her, frozen in time. The picture had been taken a few months before everything changed, before their world had collapsed under the weight of violence. Her daughter had been so full of life then, laughing at something Sarah no longer remembered, the sun catching the edges of her hair, turning them gold. Sarah traced the frame with her fingertips. For weeks, her body had been wound tight, her mind tangled in thoughts that had kept her awake at night. She had moved through the world like a shadow, haunted by what had been taken, driven by what needed to be done. Every step had been calculated, every breath measured. She had lived in the space between rage and sorrow, caught in a storm that had refused to break. But now, there was nothing left to do. No more nights spent watching, waiting. No more quiet, patient steps through alleyways. No more plans whispered only to herself. The men were gone. The ones who had walked into her home, stolen what could never be returned, had vanished from this world like they had never existed. The police had found Terrence's body 2 days ago. She had listened to the news report while sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where she had once sat while officers scribbled down notes about her daughter's murder. They spoke in detached, clinical tones, listing the details of his death. Drowning. No clear signs of struggle. No immediate suspects. They speculated. Maybe it had been a deal gone wrong. Maybe someone from his past had finally caught up to him. It didn't matter. Jason Brooks had been dumped like trash in an alley. Terrence Martin had been swallowed by the same river he had once sat beside without fear. They had left no loose ends. No whispers of revenge. No warning scrawled in blood. And no one had looked twice at her. Sarah hadn't known how she would feel when it was over. She had spent so much time chasing the moment that she had never stopped to think about what would come after. She had expected a rush of relief, maybe a weight lifting off her chest. Instead, she felt nothing. Not guilt. Not joy. Just an eerie, unfamiliar calm. She stood and walked through the house, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. The air was still, undisturbed. There was no echo of sirens in the distance, no lingering sense of dread clawing at the edges of her mind. She stepped into Lauren's room. It had remained untouched since that night, frozen in time like the photograph she had held. The bed was made, the blankets folded neatly, waiting for someone who would never return. The walls were lined with posters of musicians her daughter had loved, the corners curling slightly from years of being taped in place. Books sat stacked on the nightstand, the top one open to a page Lauren had never finished reading. Sarah sat down on the bed. The mattress barely shifted beneath her weight. She ran a hand over the comforter, smoothing out creases that had never been there. The grief was still there, buried deep, but it no longer controlled her. It no longer dictated her every breath. She had done what the police never could. She had delivered justice in the only way it could be delivered. And she did not regret it. The world outside moved on, oblivious. The city carried on with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the two lives that had been snuffed out in the name of vengeance. Sarah leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. She had no plans for tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need them.